The year is 793 AD. Monks at Lindisfarne Monastery see sails on the horizon. Within hours, their world ends. We remember this as the beginning of the Viking Age. What we rarely discuss is what happened after the warriors left. The smoke cleared. The survivors remained. And among them were women who faced a fate the chronicles barely whispered about. This is not a story of battlefield glory or seafaring adventure. This is about what happened in the spaces between battles, in the long winters after raids, in the markets of Scandinavia where human lives were bought and sold. It's about a system that operated for 3 centuries across Northern Europe, documented in legal codes, archaeological evidence, and fragmentary testimonies that somehow survived. Before we continue, understand this. What follows is based on historical evidence, primary sources, legal documents, archaeological findings, the Icelandic sagas, when cross-referenced with other records, the chronicles of those who witnessed these events firsthand. This isn't speculation. It's what the evidence tells us when we're willing to examine it completely. The Viking Age began with raids but quickly evolved into something more systematic. Early attacks targeted monasteries, wealthy, poorly defended, filled with valuable religious artifacts. But as raids intensified and settlements expanded, the objectives changed. Warriors weren't just seeking silver and gold. They were acquiring another commodity entirely. The Old Norse language had a specific term, ryle for male slaves, ambat for female slaves. These weren't borrowed words from other cultures. They were native terms, suggesting slavery was deeply embedded in Norse society long before the raids began. Archaeological excavations in Scandinavia have uncovered shackles, chains, and holding areas and trading posts like Birka and Hidi. These weren't used for livestock. Legal codes from Iceland and Norway provide uncomfortable details. The Georges, Iceland's medieval law collection, dedicates entire sections to the treatment and sale of enslaved people. It specifies ownership rights, breeding practices, and the legal status of children born to enslaved women. The law distinguished between those born into slavery and those captured in raids. The latter category was vast. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who traveled among the Rus Vikings in 922 AD, left detailed observations. He described markets where women were displayed for sale. He noted the treatment of enslaved women in Norse households. His account is clinical, observational, and deeply disturbing. He wasn't writing propaganda. He was documenting what he witnessed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that after the great armies campaigns in England, during the 860s and 870s, thousands of people simply vanished from the historical record. Entire villages emptied. When Viking settlements appeared in those same regions shortly after, archaeological evidence shows a mixed population or settlers living alongside locals. Some integration was peaceful. Much was not. Recent DNA studies of Viking Age remains tell another part of the story. In Scandinavian burial sites, researchers found women of Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Slavic origin buried according to Norse customs. The scientific data raises questions. Did these women migrate willingly? Were they captives who eventually integrated? The presence of children with mixed ancestry, combined with evidence of malnutrition and physical trauma in female remains from certain sites, suggests complex and often violent circumstances. The Irish chronicles are more explicit. The Annals of Ulster mention that in 821 AD, Norse raiders took a great prey of women from Hull. In 836 they record that the heathens won a battle against the men of Fort Rio, and many were killed and others made captive. The word used specifically referred to captives taken as plunder. Women and children comprised the majority of these captives because adult men typically fought to the death or were killed. Trading routes tell their own story. Archaeologists have traced Viking commerce networks stretching from Ireland to Constantinople, from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. These routes carried amber, furs, silver, and weapons. They also carried people. Slavery was so economically significant that some historians estimate it comprised up to 25% of the Scandinavian population during the Viking Age's peak. The scale becomes clearer when we examine specific events. After the sack of Nantes in 843 AD, Frankish chronicles report that Viking raiders departed with countless captives. Following the attack on Seville in 844 AD, Arab sources mention that survivors were taken north to be sold in distant markets. These weren't isolated incidents. This was systematic economic activity spanning generations. What happened to these captives? Where did they go? How did they live? Part 2 will examine the evidence of their experiences, the system that sustained this trade, and why these stories were buried beneath centuries of more comfortable narratives about explorers and traders. The truth requires us to look beyond the longships and into the lives they shattered. The evidence of what happened to captives appears in unexpected places. Runestones commemorate those who died in the East or in England, but they also mention those who brought back wealth. An 11th century runestone in Sweden reads Toki and his brothers raised this stone in memory of their brothers, who traveled far for gold and in the East gave food to eagles. Gave food to eagles was a poetic way of saying they killed enemies. But what isn't mentioned is what came home with the gold. Legal documents reveal the structure of enslavement in Norse society. The GRG is specified that enslaved women could be used by their owners as they wished with no legal recourse. Children born to enslaved women belonged to the owner. These weren't accidental omissions from the law, they were explicit provisions that created a hereditary underclass. Archaeological evidence from Dublin, established as a major Viking trading center around 841 AD, shows a city built partly on the slave trade. Excavations revealed holding facilities, specialized markets, and chains sized for human wrists. Dublin served as a hub where captives from raids across Ireland and Britain were processed before being shipped to Scandinavia or sold locally. The economic infrastructure was sophisticated and well organized. The Icelandic sagas, written centuries after the events they describe, still preserve traces of these realities. The Laxdœla saga mentions Melkorka, an Irish princess captured and enslaved, who pretended to be mute for years. Her story is romanticized. She eventually marries and gains freedom, but the saga casually mentions that her situation was common. Dozens of other enslaved women appear in these texts, most unnamed, their stories reduced to background details. What was life like for these women? The evidence is fragmentary but consistent. They performed domestic labor, cooking, textile production, farm work. Laws specified they could be punished physically without legal consequence. They had no right to refuse sexual demands. Children they bore might be acknowledged by their fathers or might not. Some were eventually freed, though freedom didn't erase their status as former slaves or return what was taken. The Christian conversion of Scandinavia, beginning in earnest in the 10th century, slowly changed these practices. Church law opposed slavery, though it took centuries for the institution to fully disappear. Iceland officially abolished slavery in 1117 AD. Norway followed gradually, but the transition was slow and incomplete. Former slaves and their descendants occupied the lowest social tiers for generations. Why has this history remained so obscure? Several factors converge. The Norse themselves left few written records during the Viking Age. Most sagas were written 200 to 300 years after the events, filtered through Christian perspectives that downplayed certain aspects of pagan society. The chronicles written by victims of raids, monks and priests focused on the attacks themselves, not the long-term consequences for survivors. Modern popular culture has further obscured these realities. We've created an image of Vikings as adventurous seafarers, skilled craftspeople, democratic warriors. These things were true, but they coexisted with practices we find morally reprehensible. The human capacity to compartmentalize allows societies to be sophisticated in some ways while brutal in others. Recent scholarship has begun addressing these gaps. Historians like Ruth Mazo-Karas and Neil Price have examined slavery in Viking society with greater rigor. Archaeologists like Sarah Croy have analyzed the physical evidence of captivity and forced labor. DNA researchers have traced lineages that reveal stories of displacement and forced integration. The picture that emerges is complex, not universal horror, but a system that normalized the commodification of human beings captured in war. We must ask ourselves why these stories matter now. History isn't merely about the past. It's about understanding patterns that repeat across cultures and centuries. The Viking Age demonstrates how advanced societies can sustain brutal practices, how economic systems can be built on exploitation, how victory celebrations erase the experiences of those who lose. The women taken in raids left almost no first-hand testimony. They couldn't write their own histories, but their DNA persists in modern populations. Their labor built the wealth that funded further expeditions. Their children became part of Scandinavian society, though often in its lowest ranks. They were essential to the Viking Age economy, yet nearly invisible in traditional histories. One final piece of evidence. In excavations of a Viking Age trading post in Norway, archaeologists found a small wooden tablet with runic inscriptions. Most were commercial prices, inventory lists, but one line read simply, "Remember Astrid who came from the west." Nothing more. No context, just a name and an origin. Perhaps a memorial, perhaps merely a record. But in those few words, someone acknowledged that a person existed, that she had a name, that she mattered enough to be remembered. The challenge for us is to listen to these whispers across centuries, to acknowledge what the grand narratives leave out, and to understand that every age has truths it finds convenient to forget.